My name's David Kadish. Give you a little bit of background and intro on me, just as kind of context for the lecture, and then I guess I'll be talking for about half an hour about some of the work that I do. So I started off as an engineering student, and so I come sort of initially from an engineering space, and I got interested there in AI and in robotics and in sort of complex systems. And then I took a class when I was an undergrad that sort of put a whole bunch of engineering students and a whole bunch of art students in a room together and kind of asked us to make interesting things. And so that was sort of my introduction to the art world, and I ended up sort of really enjoying that and went on to do an MFA, Master of Fine Arts, and now I'm working on my PhD, which kind of combines those different worlds in a way, and a bunch of other ones as well. And so what I'm going to do now is going to be sort of part artist talk, part kind of more academic lecture. And I'm hoping, actually judging by some of the conversations that we were having in this session just before this, I think there's going to be a lot in here that might be interesting to some of the groups. So yeah, I guess here we go. So this talk is called Designing Endemic Robots. And it's about, it's going to sort of focus on this particular robot. You can't see my mouse, can you? It's going to focus on the robot that kind of shows up in the right-hand side of the top right-hand side of the screen there, and I'll talk more about what that is kind of as we get later into the presentation. But I wanted to start off just to take a look at some of the provocations that came with this workshop, because I think there's some really interesting stuff in here. So these are pulled straight from some of the intro documents to the workshop. And a couple of things that I found really interesting in here. First is the notion of an artificial kingdom. And you'll see as I go through some of my work, I like to consider the things that I make to be kind of creatures or robotic species. And so this idea of looking at sort of the kingdoms of life and sort of tacking on a new kingdom is quite an interesting one for me. I hadn't come across it before, and I'm glad it was in there. And then beyond that, I'll probably touch a little bit on sort of these three questions, maybe not so explicitly, but kind of be able to take a look at how AI kind of mediates communication for environmental care. This question of can animals and plants and AI get involved in art, I think we'll probably touch on a little bit. And how can humans learn from animals and plants for innovative use of technology? I'm hoping we'll kind of hit on that too. To start off, I just want to begin with a little bit of context. And so I'm going to show you some of the work that I've done in the past that is not necessarily what I'm doing now, but I think there's relevance for what we're talking about here. So this is a piece that I did during my MFA. It's called Traces. And sorry. I'm going to turn the volume down a little bit, and hopefully you can still hear me talking while this is going. So this was an installation in an old apple packing factory. And one of the first things that I was interested in when I started my MFA was looking at whether you could make robots move in a manner that was sort of plant-like. And so it's almost hard to see in here. This video is actually sped up by 6 times, but these are these sort of hanging fabric sculptures that are using something called muscle wire to make these really sort of gentle, slight movements. And it's almost sort of as though if you've ever seen videos of plants sort of sped up to super high speed, you get a similar sort of quality of movement from these robots. And so they're sort of installed at this giant scale, and it's kind of oh, there you go. There's some quick movement from one of them. So if we move on from that to the next work that I did, this is actually my MFA thesis exhibition. It's called Subtle Emergences. And it took those robots and then I was sort of interested in creating more of an ecosystem out of them, right? And so instead of having them more of like a almost a sculptural painting, I wanted them to be in relation to each other and in relation more to the people who are moving through the space. And so I was interested in sort of how they would interact with each other and with light and sound of people moving through this gallery. And so you'll start to see them kind of moving around here as well. There's lights that are sort of shifting the environment. And there's a sonic element to it as well. And so this was sort of my getting into a sort of larger idea of ecosystems, how things, the relationships between these sculptures. Okay, so moving on ahead, I wanted to show you one other piece from kind of this era. And so one thing that I'm always interested in, and I think a couple of people have touched on this throughout some of the talks and presentations, is how much my own desires as a designer, as an artist, go into these systems. And I'm often really interested in actually getting away from that and sort of seeing what happens if I take my own wants out of it. And so I decided to instead try and put other people's wants into it. And so I put together a workshop that I called Inorganisms. The idea is that I could bring a whole bunch of people together and they could each build themselves a little sort of mini inorganic organism. And then they could all sort of sit in a space together and interact with each other. And so this is one that's responsive to sound. And so the idea with this one is that if you're quiet, then it would light up. And so you could hear me talking at the beginning of that video, and I was saying stuff and the thing was all dark, and then as it was quieter. Okay, so that's me narrating that little light and sound based inorganism. I wanted to show you one more piece. So once I was done with that, I ended up going to work for Philip Beasley for a year. And if you don't know Philip's work, he does these sort of architectural scale. Oops, sorry. Let me just turn the volume down so that you can hear me a little better. He does these sort of architectural scale installations. And so it uses actually that same muscle wire that I used in some of the first pieces that you saw there. And this is actually one from the Venice Biennale in 2010. And these are composed of dozens of different nodes, sensors, actuators. And the idea is that people are actually moving through this space, and these pieces are interacting both with the people, but then also with themselves. And the thing that's, I guess, relevant for what we're doing here is that when I was working in Philip's studio, that was when they started to actually try and introduce some learning, some artificial intelligence into some of these nodes. Because in this one that you're seeing, actually, all the nodes are pre-programmed. So they're reacting to things, and that's creating sort of these feedback loops, but they're not learning as they go. And so they're starting to kind of integrate these learning systems so that actually the interactions could change over time and develop over time. So on to the project that this talk is mainly about. So I've always been interested in kind of in complexity and messy environments. And one of the things that I was finding throughout all these works is that it's difficult to create that in a white box, right? It's difficult to create real complexity in the gallery. And I was also interested in what robots would do in the real world and how these kinds of robots would interact, in biological ecosystems. And so that's where this project comes from. And so designing endemic robots is part sort of framework for understanding robots in biological ecosystems. It's a set of strategies for designing robots in those systems. And it raises a set of questions about robots and ecology. And I want to sort of talk about all of those. So the thing that you're seeing up here in the corner of the screen, it's the little red kind of thing jutting out of there, is the rowdy crouse. And so I'm actually glad, I think somebody brought up Bernie Krause in the chat, couple minutes ago. So he's the namesake for this little creature. And what it is it's an embodied artificial intelligence agent that's designed to become part of a soundscape. So the idea is that it sort of enters an existing soundscape and it tries to make itself somehow part of that soundscape. And I'll explain a little bit more about what that means as we go through. So designing endemic robots, I guess the first question that we need to tackle is, what is endemism? Endemism is a concept that I've borrowed from ecology, and it refers to a species that lives sort of exclusively in one place. So a good example of this is Darwin's finches. They're sort of largely endemic to their respective islands. You can also think about a fish that might be endemic to a particular river system, and so on. There. So if we look at Darwin's finches, for example, so these are all birds that have a common ancestor, but they ended up in different habitats. They ended up in different island habitats. And they evolved different traits in order to best make use of the resources that they found there. And so now each is a distinct species that is largely endemic to the island or the island group that it evolved on. The other thing to note about them is that through the physical changes that they underwent, they now each occupy a slightly different ecological niche. And this is also an important concept in creating these kinds of endemic robots. So in this context, endemism implies an existence that's contingent on a particular set of historical, environmental, and ecological conditions. So it's a combination of happenstance and adaptation, and it's led to a set of relationships that sustain a species in a particular ecosystem. Oh, sorry, I'm just seeing the comments that people couldn't hear the videos. Yes, I was muting the videos because I wanted you to be able to hear me talking over them, although I'm hoping that you could hear some of them. Okay, we'll check when we get to the next video. So how can a robot be endemic? Because the type of specificity that endemism implies almost seems to be kind of antithetical to the way that we think of robots, right? Robots are kind of typically built to be universal. They're built to kind of be all-terrain. They're built to kind of go everywhere and nowhere in particular. They're built from parts that are mass-produced in these big factories, sent out to warehouses around the world, and they're kind of the epitome of capitalist anonymity, basically, right? So how do we go from that kind of anonymity of the universal to the particularity of the endemic? How does that work? So one way we might do that is to start to physically integrate the materials of a place into a robot, right? So we might want to use the materiality of the place to make the robot be localized in a way. So what you're seeing here is Julia Lohmann's lab, and she uses seaweed. She harvests seaweed and she makes skins for sculptural works out of that seaweed. And you can imagine, for example, a robot that has, maybe a seaweed skin from the place where it's in, and then maybe it is in some ways kind of localized to that area. You could take a look at this work by Laura Beloff, where she's sort of exploring a human microbe symbiosis using a fuel cell. And you can imagine maybe a robot kind of doing a similar thing where it's using a microbial fuel cell and sort of having a robot microbe symbiosis in order to power it, and thereby kind of integrating itself into the energy flows of an ecosystem. Yes, I'll definitely share the links to the videos at the end of the chat, for sure. Or you can imagine something like this. So this is Slugbot, and this has a whole set of ethical issues attached to it that we should probably have a discussion on a little bit later. So Slugbot was a project in the early 2000s, and the idea is that it captures slugs from gardens, and it actually digests them in a microbial fuel cell in order to power itself. And so in that way, it's actually acting a lot like a sort of predator in an ecosystem. So those are sort of the material ways of maybe integrating with an ecosystem. But one of the proposals of this project and of the robot that I built, the Rowdy Krause, is that endemism can actually be behavioral as well. So in other words, a machine can fit into an ecosystem through its actions as opposed to just through its materials. Not that materials aren't a valid way of doing that as well, but that actions are one possible way of fitting into an ecosystem. So what does this robot actually do? What does the Rowdy Krause actually do? So the idea behind it is that it attempts to develop a vocalization that will make it at home in the soundscape. And in order to do that, it uses a theory from the field of soundscape ecology called the acoustic niche hypothesis. The acoustic niche hypothesis basically states that species within a soundscape tend to not interfere with the communication of other species in a soundscape, and therefore they tend to partition the acoustic bandwidth so that each species signals on a unique set of audio frequencies. So what you're seeing here is two spectrograms. There's the spectrogram of a crow call and a spectrogram of a pigeon call. On the vertical axis, you're seeing frequency, so pitch. So basically anything higher up on the vertical axis is higher frequency, anything lower down is lower frequency, and then you're seeing time on the horizontal axis. And then the color is signifying the intensity of sound in that particular frequency at that particular time. So with the crow's call, you see sort of three distinct sounds. They have a pretty wide pitch range. They go from about 500 hertz up to about 10,000 hertz. And with the pigeon's sort of making these two distinct sounds, but they're much lower pitch. They're using much lower frequencies. And so if you kind of overlay them, what you see is that there's actually not much overlap between them, right? The pigeon is using a different set of frequencies than the crow. And this is sort of at its core, what is predicted by the acoustic niche hypothesis, that if these two species are living in the same place, they'll use different parts of the audio spectrum in order to communicate so that they don't interfere with each other. So this is what the Rowdy Krause does. The Rowdy Krause listens to determine what sounds exist in the soundscape already, and then it attempts to evolve a vocalization that's unique within the space. So it attempts to find its own acoustic niche within that sort of existing cacophony. And in doing so, it tries to carve itself out a home in a soundscape that it lives in. And I've just put here a couple of other spectrograms so you can see, for example, what just general traffic looks like, car traffic. The Rowdy Krause lived for quite a while on my balcony, and I live next to a construction site. And so I wanted to show sort of the spectrogram of construction as well. And so then when you take these all together, that is the soundscape. And then the question is, where does the Rowdy Krause fit itself in there? So how do you go about doing that? And actually, this is what I've heard a lot of you talking about today. And so I'm hoping that this will maybe inspire some of the work that you're going to be doing over the next couple of days. So one of the main ways that I tend to approach this is with the principle of what I want to do really shouldn't matter at all. That my wants, my desires, my things that I'm looking for shouldn't be the driving force of the design work. The overarching goal should always be to figure out, okay, what fits best within the ecosystem that the Rowdy Krause is going to live within. And I guess to translate to some of your work, it could be, what is it that the plants are trying to say? What is it that the plants are feeling, if that's actually the right question? And so really sort of taking your own, taking my own aesthetic desires out of it. Now, of course, that changes if some of you had projects that were talking about human users as well, and then, of course, that's a different scenario. But actually, Spela mentioned something similar to this in her talk on Wednesday when she was talking about the robot that was playing games with plants. I don't know if you all remember the one that had little balls that were dropping down. And she mentioned that they were trying to sort of minimize the rule set so that the plants could decide what the game was. And it's kind of a similar approach, I think. Now, attempting to remove my own preferences from the design process recalls a quote from the artist Raffaello Santahammer, who claims that, he says, most electronic artists are looking for a sort of out of control quality that will result in their work actually having outcomes that they didn't anticipate. And for him, if the piece doesn't surprise him in some way, then it's not truly successful. And I think that's something that I take to heart a lot in my work. If I'm sort of not a little bit surprised by what's happening, then I'm sort of like, oh, well, that was a little bit too predictable. I think maybe too much of myself is in this. So in order to remove myself from the process as much as possible, I decided to have the rowdy crows use computational evolution to decide what kinds of sounds it would make. And the idea is that that way my design work is second order. So I don't have direct control over what's happening at the end of the process. I'm responsible for setting up the frame in the system, but I can't kind of directly say, that's not the end result that I wanted, and here's how I would change it. I've been working with something called NEAT, which is the Neuroevolution of Augmenting Topologies. And I've been doing this for a while, and so it seemed like a good choice for continuing as an algorithm to use. Without going into too much detail, but if somebody's interested towards the end, I can explain a little bit more. But it makes it possible to begin with a very simple artificial neural network. And then it makes it able to add complexity to the system as needed. So you start off with a simple network, and then if you need more complexity, the evolutionary algorithm can add more complexity into the neural network. And so you can start to develop more complex actions as you move along the evolutionary process. So I'm assuming that most people have a basic idea of how neural nets work, but maybe just to kind of refresh a little bit, the 3 dots at the top are input neurons. And so you have some sort of numerical input that goes through those neurons. And those are processed through a series of convolutions, through a series of mathematical operations, through the other neurons of the neural network. And then you have these 2 output neurons, in this diagram anyways, these 2 output neurons at the end, and you get some sort of numerical output from that. And then there has to be some way of translating that into sound. So how do we translate that into sound? Because that's the next design question that you sort of have to go through. And so there's 3 things that kind of came up as relatively obvious solutions for me, 3 ways of relatively simple ways of going about it. One is to take the outputs of the neural network and use them to play MIDI notes, for example, right? So you can sort of define a MIDI instrument and map the outputs of the neural network to the MIDI instrument, and then you get something that's playing some sort of sound. You could also use sort of pure sine waves. So you could have each output of the neural network control a sine wave, and then you could have them sort of mix and match sine waves to produce, again, some sort of mix of pure tones that is a sound in some ways. Or you could also have sort of pre-recorded sounds that it would then kind of pick and remix and kind of act as like a neural network DJ, and then be able to produce sound to put into the environment. But all of these seem to have, I guess, kind of problems with it, right? The MIDI felt like it would be a little bit too musical, and I didn't quite want that. Pure sine waves tend to sound very R2D2-y, and that wasn't what I was looking for either. And in terms of remixing sounds, I wanted it to be able to make its own sound. I didn't want it to sort of have to take something from the environment already and have that be its voice. I wanted it to be able to develop its own independent voice. The other thing is to know about neural networks is that they often like to find the easy way out. They often find a solution that looks optimal to them, but isn't necessarily interesting to anybody else. So the picture you're seeing here is just an example that I found, but this is a neural network that was designed to detect pneumonia in patient scans. And what they found, strangely, was that it worked really well for certain hospitals, but not for others. And it turns out that what it did was that it learned to detect the hospital-specific metal token that showed up in the scan, and then using data about how how prevalent pneumonia was in certain hospitals, it could actually come up with a pretty good guess of whether or not the patient had pneumonia without actually learning anything about what pneumonia looked like. And so when they started trying it on new hospitals, they found that it was wildly inaccurate, and it's because it didn't have this prior data of how prevalent pneumonia was there. And so then they realized that their neural network is actually doing entirely the wrong thing. And this is what I mean by neural networks kind of taking the easy way out. So if I use something like overlapping sine waves to generate sound, I basically expect that the rowdy Krause would find the single tone that was the most different from the sounds that it was hearing, and then basically do something like, ee, which is really not what you want out of this. And so I started to look for some other solution, some other way of creating sound through the neural network. And one of the things that I thought was, okay, well, if it's good for me to have less control over how the sound is produced, maybe it's good for the neural network to have less direct control over the frequencies that it's producing, because its target is to produce specific frequencies. So if I put something as an intermediary, maybe it will come up with something slightly more interesting. And so I made this decision that it should have some sort of instrument, not necessarily a musical instrument, but some sort of instrument that it should be playing. And that's when I happened upon the pink trombone. So I'm going to exit the presentation for a second and see if I can pull this up. Can everyone still see here? Yep. Can everyone hear now? Is this isn't coming through. Oh no. So I can see you guys now. Just to double check, you weren't hearing what was being produced from the video there. All right, that's a shame. I will, so what I'll do is I'll post a link to that. You can play with it. It's actually quite a bit of fun, but basically it's a mouth that you get to play with making sounds out of. And so you can just sort of click around, you can move the tongue around, you can control pitch. I'll post a link and you can have a fun time with that once we're done here. Okay, so let's get back to this. Woo. Just to check, could you hear the videos before I turn the sound down?
No.
Okay. Anybody know what to do with Zoom to make that happen? Because that's going to be important in the next couple of videos.
You need to take out your phones, because take
you
off.
should just.
Should I pull out my headphones? Okay. Let's see if that works any better. Actually, I'm just going to try the pink trombone again just to see if that that made any difference. Sorry. Can you hear now? There we go. Okay, well now I can show you the pink trombone. So this is the pink trombone, and I just thought this was fantastic. Okay, so we'll keep that quiet for now and move back to the presentation. And excellent, glad that everyone can kind of hear the sounds. Okay, so I got to programming. So I put together an evolutionary neural network. I found a way to connect it to the pink trombone. And I put it all together and I ran it on my laptop. And it came out as something that sounded like this. So this is the evolution sort of running. It's recorded, but it was running in real time. And so you're seeing the evolutionary process. And I should mention in the background, you're hearing the sounds that it's using to evolve against. So it's evolving against sounds that I recorded in a garden that I was working in. So you hear birds chirping a little bit in the background. And what you're seeing actually is the evolutionary process move through different individuals. And every time it changes kind of the schema of what it's doing, it's a new individual in the evolutionary process. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit later in the evolutionary process. We'll just listen for another couple seconds. Okay. So, okay, I thought that was a pretty decent first attempt. But that was running on my laptop, and so I wanted to get it into a kind of embodied agent that could actually live out in an ecosystem somewhere. And so, of course, I started running into trouble as soon as I began moving from proof of concept towards this like embedded prototype that I wanted to develop. This hacked together mess that was the system that produced that first thing had absolutely no hope of running properly on a Raspberry Pi. It was super computationally intensive. And in fact, Raspberry Pi was too slow to even run pink trombone properly, never mind the actual evolutionary algorithm that was running alongside it. So I had to change things up a little bit. And so the solution was to take the pink trombone code and translate it into Python so that it no longer had to run in real time. And also actually that meant that it integrated better with the evolutionary code that I had written, which was also written in Python. And so now I had a system that was possible to run on the Raspberry Pi. Now, why am I telling you this? Most of the time you'll see this in a paper and it'll say something like, for implementation details, see appendix, that's not important, whatever. But I bring them up here because they're actually quite essential. When you're doing work like this, it really depends on, it really matters how you implement it and how you go about putting these things together. Now, if you remember, I said about 5 or 10 minutes ago that that neural networks tend to like to exploit edge cases and like to cheat. Well, it turns out that my Python implementation wasn't exactly the same as the original pink trombone that I was using. And so what started to happen was that the rowdy crust started producing things like these high-pitched sine waves, basically, and long samples where it was just silent because it decided that that was actually the most effective technique. And so now I had this system I thought was working, but it turned out it was doing something entirely different from what I had thought it was doing before. Now, remember, what I wanted wasn't supposed to matter, but this really wasn't what I wanted. And so I decided I had to take some sort of action. And so what I did was I tweaked the evolutionary incentives. One thing that I noticed was that by focusing only on frequencies, I had ignored two important things in robot and animal communication, timing and temporal changes in vocalization, but also that no creature actually just makes noise to fit into an ecosystem. That's not the point of making noise. Creatures make noise in order to communicate something, and vocalizations contain information that someone or something is supposed to interpret, right? So it might be a mating call or an alarm cry, but there's some sort of information there. And a sine wave has very little information in it. So I added an incentive to the evolutionary algorithm for acoustic entropy to encourage vocalizations that contain variation, which implies information, right? So in communication theory, higher entropy implies the existence of more information. And so I added this as an incentive for the evolutionary algorithm. I also added an incentive to produce sounds that were different, not only from the sounds that were heard in the ecosystem, but also from the sounds that the rowdy crowd had produced before. And in machine learning and AI, this is called a type of novelty search. So it's looking for things that are new. And this was partially to discourage it from getting stuck producing one type of sounds, so that it would actually explore kind of the range of possible sounds that that it might be able to make. Oh, sorry, there was fade-ins on this slide. Okay, so this is the end result, and this is actually the view. If you're looking just over to the right of me now, this is the view out my bedroom window onto my balcony where the robot was living. And what you're going to hear is, it's a sped up video, but you'll hear sounds from the ecosystem that the robot recorded, and then also the sounds that it eventually produced. Okay, so that's the rowdy crowd. So the design process raises a few questions. Can the rowdy crowd in the end be considered an endemic creature in the ecosystem outside of my apartment? how much can it be considered a part of the ecosystem and outside of my own aesthetic preferences if I was, as I've admitted, adjusting the algorithms when they didn't produce something that was kind of in the general range of what I was looking for? And this is a question that's arisen often for me in this type of work. Is the thing that I've built broken, or is it actually doing what it should be? It's just not what I thought I wanted. So sometimes the answer seems more clear than others. Occasionally in testing the system, I discover an error in my translation of the pink trombone code, and fixing that, which is kind of an error in the underlying logic of things, didn't feel like kind of inserting my desires into the process. But I also adjusted the evolutionary incentives when it wasn't producing the kinds of sounds that I wanted. And if I'm being completely honest, I was going to bed one night and I realized that I could hear it screeching through the balcony window, and so I logged on and turned the volume down because I didn't want to sleep to that. So I think this is a much longer discussion, and we're not going to solve it here. But I think it's an important question. How can a robot be considered an independent creature with autonomy over its actions if it can, if I can just turn down the volume or turn it off if it gets too annoying? And I guess more importantly for us, can it be a product of its ecosystem if I can tweak its algorithmic incentives, right? Because part of the idea is that it's becoming part of the ecosystem by learning from the ecosystem. But if I can change it at any time, then how much is that actually true? Like I said, I don't think I have an answer to that, and I don't think we can consider this by any means a settled question. But I think one possible way of looking at it is that it has some sort of quasi-autonomy. It has some degrees of freedom, degrees of independence, but of course, it's still in relation to its human creator, but then also in relation to the things that are making sound in the ecosystem, humans, but then also birds and dogs. That's really most of the wildlife that's outside my apartment. So I think we can sort of assign it this sort of partial degree of autonomy, but of course it's not its own fully independent thing. And how much autonomy we assign it, I think, is an open question. The other question is the rowdy grouse endemic? And I think I'm sort of running short on time here, so I'm going to sort of move through this, try and move through this a little bit quickly. So this is, just for reference, this is the ecosystem that it's kind of living in. So this is the view from my balcony. So there's a park, there's a couple of streets, so you get a lot of car traffic. There's a big construction site, so there's a lot of construction noise right now, especially during the middle of the day. And I should note, actually, that's a hospital there too, so there's a lot of ambulances kind of going back and forth all the time. So it's a very noisy environment. But there's also often a lot of birds in the park, and you'll get, like I said, dogs walking by, and so there's other sorts of noise as well. So this is a plot, and basically what this plot shows is a two-dimensional representation of the spectrum of the sounds that were produced by the rowdy grouse and that were recorded from the balcony. So the green sounds were sounds of the ecosystem of that, the cars and the construction and whatever else that were recorded from the balcony, and the blue sounds are the sounds that were produced by the rowdy grouse. And I'm using something called a T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding. I can post a link to how to do that if anyone's interested. But basically, what it does is it groups things that are alike. And so what you can see is, with a few exceptions, oh, I forgot to mention, the lighter blue sounds are ones from earlier in the evolution. The darker blue ones are from later in the evolutionary process. So as you can see, with a few exceptions, most of the evolved sounds are clustered together in the bottom left of the plot, and all of the recorded sounds are clustered together up in the top right. And because this is a projection of the spectral data, what this means is that the evolved sounds are largely spectrally distinct from the recorded ones. And so that means that we can say that in our definition of acoustic niche, the rowdy grouse has in fact found itself an acoustic niche in the soundscape. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's endemic. And so I wanted to take a look at this graph, which is showing similar data, but it's including some data from a virtual rowdy grouse that I did over the summer, using recordings from the soundscape in Peely Point National Park in Canada. And so those recordings, those soundscape recordings from Peely Point are shown in purple, and the evolved sounds of the virtual rowdy crowds are shown in orange. And again, you can see that with a few exceptions, most of the evolved sounds from Peely Point are pretty distinct from the recorded sounds from Peely Point. So that's good. It's again found itself an acoustic niche in that virtual space. But the other thing that you can see is that there's not much overlap between the sounds that were evolved in Peely Point and the sounds that were evolved on my balcony. And so what we can say by that is that actually, so this is a graph of just the sounds that were evolved on my balcony and the sounds that were evolved in Peely Point. And what that means is that the robot evolved its vocalizations differently, distinctly in Peely Point from the way it evolved its vocalizations on my balcony. And what that means is that in fact, it has a specific relationship with these places in much the same way that the finches evolved differently, the sounds of the robot evolved differently, and we can think about actually calling it endemic. So just to kind of sum up, endemic robots implies this kind of a robot with a behavior that is particular to an ecosystem that has kind of arisen out of a historical and ecological context. One strategy, and I'm not saying this is the only strategy, but a strategy that I tend to use involves CD control over the robot's actions and trying as much as possible to allow the ecosystem to drive the development of the robot's behavior. And important for what we're doing here is that AI provides sort of a medium for creating distance between the desires of the human designer and the actions of the robot. And it also provides a medium for allowing the ecosystem to contribute to the development of the robot's voice and to the development of the robot's behavior. Okay, thank you all for watching, and hopefully there's some questions.